Hello everyone, Bob Niels, and welcome to Database Design, Entities, and Entity Relationships. Here we go. The objectives of this particular video is to take everything we've learned, okay, in regards to the purpose of a database and collecting the requirements of a particular database and start understanding those requirements and breaking down those requirements to determine what our database should look like. The vehicle in which we're going to build upon our database are a word called entity. Okay, we're going to define the entities within our requirements as we go through it. Okay, so the basis of everything are these entities and their relationships to each other as they relate to a relational database. With that said, our objectives for this particular video are to determine what an entity is, how to identify entities from those requirements, determine what an entity relationship is, and determine relationships between each entity, and finally talk about how to illustrate all of this with an entity relationship diagram. I have a note here basically stating I want you to understand this is going to be kind of a wordy video, if I could say it. And one that's, we're just going to kind of walk through the process. The next video is a practical example of actually doing it as we walk through. So if this video gets a little confusing, make sure you listen to the next video, and hopefully the two combined will add clarity to help you with your attempt at developing your first databases as we move forward. Okay? With that said, let's keep it really simple. What is an entity? Well, an entity in life is basically a person, place, or thing. Unit, object, whatever you want to say. Item, with that case. I look at it as this. An entity is a noun. It's just a noun. A person, place, or thing. Whatever you want to call a noun or define a noun, it's that. Can it be an object or a unit or an item? Of course it can. To me, those are person, places, or things too. So with that said, that's what it is. It's a noun. In database world, an entity is a thing, person, place, whatever, person, place, or thing, which data should be captured and stored. That's what we're trying to determine. We want to basically define our entities from our requirements, and those are going to be the things that we're going to capture data and store that data. Does that make sense, hopefully? That's what we're trying to do. So, if we have requirements to do a student database, student could be an entity because we want to store information about that student. First name, last name, student ID, social security number, I don't know, your address, gender, all kinds of things we probably want to capture and store about you for all kinds of reasons that probably should have been defined in the requirements. All right, well, that's fine, right? So now we know what an entity is. So I'll make it any harder than that. That's all it is. So what we want to do is define the potential entities based upon the requirements in which you just gave us. Okay? Or what you didn't give us, but basically we obtain from our customer or our client. To do that, you need to take those requirements that you just collected and you need to disseminate those requirements, basically review them and break down those requirements and find all the nouns that were in those requirements. Just start listing them down. If you have it's all recorded, your requirements gathering are recorded, listen to it. And when a noun pops up, start listing it down. Don't think about it. Don't worry about it. List it. Okay? No thinking's allowed at this point in time. All right? Just list it. Brainstorm. Pretty easy. Once you have this initial list, what you're going to do now is walk through this list and start paring it down based upon a couple rules. All right? They're pretty simple. The first thing you're going to do is make sure there's no duplications or basically synonyms within your list. Student and pupil, student and scholar, teacher and instructor, instructor and professor, courses in a class. Those are all synonyms of each other, potentially. It might be that professor needs to be treated differently in the database or the requirements than an instructor would. Not sure why, but they could. And if that's the case, you may need to keep both of those entities. Okay? However, if you have a synonym and they basically mean the exact same thing, just based upon your discussions, they came up two different ways, you need to figure out which one you want and delete the other one from your list. If you don't know which one you want, you may want to ask your customer what's used more often within their daily discussions about their business, okay? So if you came to Cincinnati State and you asked our president, what do you call your students? Do you call them students or scholars or pupils? And she said, we always call them students. I thought, then use students, okay? You may ask her, what do you call your teachers here? Do you call them teachers or instructors or professors? And she may say, well, we call them instructors for the most part. Then keep the word instructor. And then finally, for courses, the same type of thing. Hope that makes sense. Then eliminate the others. Once you have those down, you need to make sure all the remaining entities are a person, place, thing, or object that, again, it's not literally listed here, but again, that you're going to store data for. If you start recognizing you have things on your list, nouns, if you will, on your list, that you're not going to really ever store data for, you need to eliminate them. Another thing you need to look at, which could follow in both categories here, is output vehicles should be eliminated from the list, such as the word list or reports or paychecks. You know, also you say this person gets this paycheck. A paycheck is an output of a process, and we're not going to store data about a paycheck. All right, we're going to derive that paycheck based upon data. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're looking at, you know, things we want to capture. We're capturing data, but output vehicles, when you hear the word reports and list and types of reports, which a paycheck could be, end of month report or something that tells you about that they take this and do something with it. Yeah, it's a noun, but eliminate that from the entity list. You would never have an entity for that particular type of thing. Again, that's something that's derived, not something you're going to store data for. Okay, that's it. If you apply those simple rules we just kind of went through to your initial entity list, you will end up with a final entity list. It takes some practice, but it really isn't that hard. This is not rocket science. All you're doing is identifying the nouns and figuring out which of these nouns you're really going to be storing data for in the end. And if you have a noun that means the same thing, like instructor and teacher, eliminate one of them and use the one that's more commonly used within the business. Once you have all of that, now our job is to identify the relationships between these nouns. Let's step back for one more piece here. Let me say this one more time. Now that you have your entities, you may want to, you know, discuss this with your customer. You can always go back and talk to them and say, have I identified all the pieces, you know, or the players, if you will, that really make up your business? And if the answer is yes, you basically have now accomplished a big thing when it comes to database design. You have now accomplished the entities and defined the entities, which in the end make up our database. All right. With all that said, because we're doing a relational database, we now need to understand the relationships between them. Okay? So why are we doing this? Once again, we're developing a relational database. As we stated before, each entity will be a table, and each table will be related to another table. So we're getting there pretty fast already. If we keep up at this pace, we might be done with this course in a couple of weeks. Just kidding. There's a lot to cover. So what is an entity relationship? Well, what we're looking at is we have one noun that's related to another noun. And what we want to look at to see if there's a potential relationship between these nouns. So your job is to take this final list and identify if there's a relationship. There might be none, but if there is one, you need to determine what it is. It's either a one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many. Okay? It has to be one of those three. And I guess you could actually add a fourth. None. There is no relationship. But if there is one, it's either one-to-one, which means that there's a direct correlation between the two. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, your student ID could be a noun, and it's a one-to-one relationship to you. Nobody else can share that ID. But one-to-many. So in this case here, for maybe every instructor, I can teach many courses. So every one instructor can teach many courses. And a many-to-many situation could be one that sits back and says, for every student, they can take many courses. And for every course, there could be many students in that course. So one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. The goal is to understand the direct relationships, if there are any, between each entity in the list. We do this by starting with an entity and asking, is there a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, or none relationship between them? That's all we do. And you go through the entire list and exhaust that list. If you end up with a lot of entities, this could be a exhaustive step. So you need to look at that as you go through. Since we've been dealing with this student and course and instructor, for our case, we identified the following entities, okay, based upon some of the examples we've been walking through: student, course, and instructor. That would be the three entities we have. So what are the relationships between these entities? I kind of stated this before, but let's go through it one more time. For student, there is the following direct relationship with the other entities. Student can take many courses. A student cannot take many instructors directly. There's no direct relationship there. There's an indirect relationship, but not a direct relationship. A student does not take an instructor. You might want to take that instructor, and you might follow all those courses, but you take the course. And in some cases, the instructor can change at the last minute. So you don't take the instructor. You don't go online and register for an instructor. You register for a course. The makeup of that course is the instructor. Does that make sense? We're looking for direct relationships, not indirect relationships, when we're building these entity relationship diagrams, or in this case, determining our relationships between the entities. For courses, the following direct relationships are these. For each course, it can be many students. Okay? For each course, it can be taught by only one instructor. So when we look at students, students can take many courses. And now we're saying for each course, there could be many students. Well, that makes sense. There's usually more than one student that signs up for our course, hopefully. If there wasn't, we probably wouldn't run the course. And then for each course, it can be taught by only one instructor. Those are the rules for this particular college, okay? In our college, we actually have situations where multiple instructors can teach a course, but for these particular requirements, we'll assume there is only going to be taught by one instructor, all right? And then for instructor, their direct relationships goes back to students, okay? I'm sorry, to courses. So an instructor, though, can teach many courses. So in this case, a course can only have one instructor, but an instructor can teach multiple courses. These are the relationships we need to understand. All right. Once again, instructors can teach many students, but only indirectly. Okay. They don't teach students, they teach courses in which students are part of. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So where are we? Whew, I know it's getting wordy. I apologize. So once again, we identified our requirements. We identified our initial entity list. We pared that down to get our final entity list. And now we're looking at relationships. All this plays a huge part in building our database. All right. So in the end, what do we have? We basically said with our entity list of students, courses, and instructors that a student has a many relationship with courses, meaning a student can take many courses and a course can have many students. And in this also, in the end, courses has a many-to-one relationship, meaning that a course can have only one instructor. That's okay, but then for an instructor can teach many courses. Does that make sense? Look at that one more time. I know this is all kind of new, and I know this is early in the curriculum, but just see if you can follow it. Don't make it hard. There's nothing hard here. We're just looking at relationships between entities based upon requirements. Okay? Well, putting all this in words does get confusing. There's no doubt about it. Okay? And so everything in IT, like everything in life, we love to draw things out to make it a little bit easier, right? A picture paints 1,000 words. Have you heard that poem before? I don't know. Maybe I'm too old. With that said, so an entity relationship diagram is an illustrative representation of the defined relationships of the identified entities of our project. Okay? So once again, it's an illustrated representation of the defined relationships, one to many, one to one, whatever it is, of our identified entities. Basically, I'm saying our final entity list from our project. What's it look like? This right here. So I basically build little blocks to represent each entity. And then with that said, based upon the lines, it's kind of telling us exactly what those relationships are. As you see at the end of a couple of those, at first line there, let me see if I can get my piece up there to kind of show you this right here. You'll see this little thing right here. We'll call this a crow's feet, right? And so that crow's feet represents the word many. And so in this case here, there is a many-to-many relationship between student and course. And in this case here, there is a many-to-one relationship between course and instructor, which basically says for every course, there can be one instructor, okay? And for instructor, there can be many courses. So an instructor can teach many courses. Does that make sense? You might be looking at those lines going, okay. Well, I provide you in the resources a nice PDF that's a little cheat sheet on how to read an entity relationship diagram. For the most part, what this is saying here, that a student can take multiple courses. In this case, those two lines right there says a course can only have one instructor. That's what those two lines mean. So there's a little bit of, shortcuts, I want to say shortcuts, shorthand here, that again, go look at the resources under entity relationship diagrams, and I provide you with a PDF that explains it all. The goal here is, though, you have a nice illustration versus a bunch of words. It's saying, now I understand the relationship between these entities. What does this all mean? It means we're well on our way of designing a database. We're well on our way of understanding the requirements, and we're well on our way of doing something pretty cool for our customer. Okay? Now it's time to put it to use. As I mentioned before, we're going to go ahead and do one together and walk through a practical example, making sure you understand.